It began at 0400 hours, enemy missiles raining down like fire from the sky. Alpha Base was torn apart in minutes, barracks collapsing, towers burning, screams echoing through the smoke. Then, the bunker door exploded open. Smoke and fire poured in, enemy rifles raised. And there she stood, Lieutenant Mira Callen, just one medic against an entire squad. Behind her, 18 wounded soldiers, too weak to fight, depending only on her. She had no heavy weapons, no reinforcements, only courage. Mira's voice cut through the chaos. If you want them, you'll have to go through me. When the commander arrived hours later, the battlefield was silent, because Mira had already done the impossible. At exactly 4 a.m., the first missile screamed across the night sky and slammed into Alpha Base. The explosion ripped the silence apart, shaking the ground and hurling soldiers from their bunks. Within minutes, more missiles followed, striking with surgical precision. The communications tower was the first to vanish. Its steel frame twisted and fell like a torch in the darkness. The barracks were next, collapsing in on themselves as men and women inside fought to escape flames and falling debris. In less than 10 minutes, the stronghold that had taken years to build looked more like a graveyard than a base. Smoke rose in towering plumes. Flames lit the dawn before the sun ever appeared, and the cries of the wounded filled the air with chaos. Inside the medical bay, Lieutenant Mira Callen was thrown across the room as the first blast shattered the windows and tore through the structure. A medic, not a fighter, her duty had always been to keep soldiers breathing, not to pick up a rifle. But when she pulled herself up from the floor, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead, Mira didn't hesitate. She knew the missiles would keep coming, and she knew within seconds that her bay was about to turn into the only place left where life still clung on. The doors burst open with the first wave of wounded. A young private staggered in, his uniform shredded, shrapnel lodged deep in his side. Behind him, two soldiers dragged in a third who was unconscious, his head covered in blood. More followed. Broken bones, burns, and chest wounds all arrived at once. Within minutes, the sterile medical bay became a storm of cries, blood, and the relentless thud of explosions outside. Mira's training took over. She pushed aside her own fear and pain, barking orders with clarity. Get him on the table. Apply pressure. Don't stop. You, grab gauze. Wrap his arm tight. Even as the walls shook and ceiling tiles fell, she stayed steady, moving from one patient to the next. Her hands were covered in blood, but they never trembled. When another missile landed nearby, the entire east wing of the bay began to collapse. Mira knew the building wouldn't hold. She made the call that would define the rest of the night: evacuation to the basement. The underground storage chamber, built of reinforced concrete, wasn't meant to be a hospital, but it was the only place strong enough to withstand the bombardment. One by one, she directed soldiers to carry the wounded below, while she stabilized others long enough to be moved. What began as a storage room of supplies quickly transformed into a bunker hospital. Stretcher cases lined the walls, bandaged men lay shoulder to shoulder, and Mira worked by the dim glow of flashlights, turning a place of shadows into a sanctuary. She had no heavy weapons to defend herself. No reinforcements were on the way. Outside, Alpha Base was burning to the ground, and inside the bunker she had 18 wounded soldiers, too weak to fight, too broken to survive without her. Mira knew she could not fight back against the enemy, but she could fight for time, for life. And so, with every bandage tied, every wound stitched, every whispered order to hold on, she refused to let death claim what the bombs had spared. Hours later, when the barrage had finally ended, Commander Nathaniel Briggs arrived with the rescue force. His boots crunched over ash and debris as he surveyed the devastation. He had prepared himself for silence. Rows of bodies, nothing left to save. Instead, what greeted him was a scene he would never forget. A single medic, uniform scorched and dirt-stained, standing in front of 18 wounded soldiers who were still alive. Against all odds, Lieutenant Mira Callen had turned a massacre into a miracle. What happened at Alpha Base shows a truth few outsiders see. The heaviest burden in war is often carried not by those with rifles, but by those with bandages. Lieutenant Mira Callen fought not against soldiers, but against time, shock, and blood loss. Her choices left deeper scars than bullets, because medics remember every face they couldn't save. They don't fight for ground or glory. They fight for heartbeats, for the chance of another sunrise. And that night, Mira proved the strongest warrior isn't always the one who kills, but the one who keeps others alive. When the east wing of the medical bay began to collapse, Lieutenant Mira Callen knew she had only moments to make a decision. The ceiling tiles were falling, the walls cracked with every new blast, and smoke was pouring in through the vents. Staying put meant watching the roof bury the wounded alive. Evacuation was the only option, but where? Her eyes turned to the reinforced storage basement beneath the bay. It was never meant for patients, only supplies, spare generators, and crates of medical kits, but its concrete walls were designed to withstand bombardment. In that moment, Mira didn't hesitate. "Move them down," she ordered. "Now!" Soldiers who could still walk were put to work carrying those who couldn't. Stretchers scraped across the floor as Mira directed the flow, shouting over the sound of distant detonations. Every trip down the stairs was a gamble. The structure above threatened to collapse, and at any moment another missile could land. Yet the alternative was worse. Staying where they were guaranteed death. Within half an hour, the basement had transformed from a dusty storeroom into a battlefield hospital. Emergency lights flickered dimly, casting long shadows across rows of wounded men and women. There were no sterile beds, no proper operating tables, just crates and cold concrete. But under Mira's command, it became a sanctuary. Here, Mira's training became the dividing line between chaos and order. Battlefield triage is brutal in its simplicity. You sort the wounded into categories: those who will live with minimal help, those who need urgent care to survive, and those who are too far gone. It's not about who deserves help most. It's about saving as many lives as possible with the resources at hand. Mira moved from patient to patient with unflinching focus. A young private with a severe chest wound. Priority 1. She improvised a chest seal from plastic packaging, pressing it tight to stop the air leak. Another soldier had lost too much blood. She started transfusions using limited IV bags, rationing carefully because she knew more were coming. For minor shrapnel wounds, she handed off care to the walking wounded, teaching them in seconds how to apply pressure and dress a wound. Every decision she made in those hours was a choice about survival. She had to ask herself, who do I treat now? Who can wait? Who won't make it, even if I give everything? These are choices that leave scars, yet Mira carried them without flinching, because hesitation would have cost more lives. What Mira did in that basement wasn't just medicine, it was pure crisis management. Her struggle mirrored what paramedics, ER doctors, or firefighters face in disasters, choosing who to save first, improvising with what little they have, and staying calm when panic is easier. Whether in war or civilian life, triage is about one thing: preserving the most lives when resources are scarce. There's a reason battlefield medicine often inspires civilian emergency systems. Many of the techniques Mira used, tourniquets, improvised chest seals, even the idea of golden hour treatment, are now standard in ambulances worldwide. And in turn, civilians bring those lessons back to war. It's a cycle of knowledge born from crisis, applied wherever humans bleed and lives hang in the balance. But here's the deeper truth. While combat soldiers are trained to fight the enemy, medics like Mira are trained to fight inevitability. And in that basement, inevitability looked like smoke-filled air, dwindling supplies, and the heavy silence of soldiers slipping into unconsciousness. Yet she refused to yield. Hours passed in the basement, each second marked by the beep of a heart monitor rigged to a dying battery, or the strained breathing of a soldier fighting shock. Mira barely rested, moving like a shadow from one patient to the next. She delegated tasks to the semi-injured. "Hold this bandage. Keep pressure here. Don't let him fall asleep." She wasn't just a medic anymore. She was commander of survival. For the soldiers lying on the floor, she became more than a medic. She was proof that they hadn't been abandoned, that even in the darkest hours, someone was still fighting for them. And that psychological lifeline mattered almost as much as the bandages. In war, belief is often the difference between a soldier who gives up and one who clings to life. Mira gave them reason to cling. When Commander Briggs would later hear how Mira turned a basement into a functioning hospital, he admitted something few commanders ever say. "She carried more command in those hours than I did with an entire battalion." And that is the lesson of the basement hospital. Sometimes leadership is not the one who gives orders to fight, but the one who refuses to let anyone die alone. The basement walls shuddered with every distant blast. Smoke seeped through cracks in the concrete, stinging eyes and throats. Lieutenant Mira Callen knew time was running out. Staying in the storage basement had bought her patients a few precious hours, but it was no longer safe. The fire above had spread uncontrollably, and the air was thickening with every passing minute. 18 wounded soldiers, some barely conscious, were depending on her to make a decision no one wanted to face. "There's an emergency exit," she finally said, her voice calm but firm. "It leads into the old tunnel system beneath the base. If we can make it through, we'll reach the vehicle maintenance bunker on the other side." The soldiers looked at her in disbelief. Private Williams, supporting his broken arm in a makeshift sling, shook his head. "Ma'am, that whole area's on fire. If the artillery doesn't kill us, the smoke will. We'd be better off waiting here until help arrives." Mira met his gaze steadily. "If we stay here, the fire reaches us before the rescue team does. We don't have that long. The tunnels are our only chance." Corporal Jackson muttered what everyone was thinking. "She's a medic, not a commander. We should be holding our ground, not crawling through fire." Mira didn't raise her voice, but the steel in her tone silenced the room. "I'm not asking, I'm telling you. We move now, or we don't move at all. And if we don't move, these men die in this basement. That's the reality. Honey." Her authority didn't come from rank. It came from the unshakable calm of someone who had already carried them this far through chaos. Slowly, even the doubters realized they had no choice but to follow. The emergency hatch groaned open with rusted reluctance. A wave of smoke rolled in, carrying the acrid smell of burning fuel. Mira led from the front, flashlight in one hand, the other steadying the stretcher carried by two half-injured men. Behind her, the line of soldiers moved like shadows, some walking, some limping, others dragged along improvised stretchers, fashioned from doors and blankets. The tunnels were narrow, barely wide enough for two men side by side. Heat radiated from the walls, and the ceiling above shook as artillery pounded the surface. Every few minutes, debris fell in choking clouds of dust. "Keep moving," Mira urged, her voice cutting through the haze. She checked each stretcher as they went, making sure her most critical patients were still breathing. Private Chen, concussed and slipping in and out of consciousness, clutched her hand briefly as they passed through one section, where flames licked through cracks in the tunnel ceiling. She squeezed back, whispering, "Stay with me. Just a little farther." They moved for nearly 45 minutes, the tunnel twisting, rising, and falling like a labyrinth designed to test every ounce of endurance. At one point, the passage narrowed to the point that stretchers had to be tilted sideways to fit through. Another time, a ceiling beam collapsed ahead, and Mira crawled through the smoke herself to check stability before allowing anyone else to pass. Her lungs burned, her uniform was streaked with soot, but she never faltered. Exhaustion and fear gnawed at the men. Halfway through, Sergeant Torres whispered urgently, "Ma'am, some of these guys won't make it. We're slowing down. If enemy forces are outside, we're walking into their arms." Mira stopped just long enough to look him in the eyes. "Torres, I know you're scared. So am I. But I will not leave anyone behind in that basement to suffocate. You want to survive? Then trust me, keep them moving." Her conviction was unbreakable. No soldier, not even the hardened veterans among them, could argue with that resolve. For all their doubts, they followed her because she gave them no alternative but courage. When the tunnel finally opened into the vehicle maintenance bunker, the sight was almost miraculous. The underground chamber was wide with steel beams and reinforced walls that had held against the onslaught. There was no equipment left, only empty bays where armored vehicles had once been stationed. But it was shelter. The soldiers collapsed where they stood, dragging stretchers into rough lines against the walls. Mira immediately began reorganizing. "Jackson, set up lights. Williams, check the cabinets for emergency kits. Torres, keep the door secure." She turned chaos into order in minutes, just as she had in the basement. Her patients were still alive. Against fire, smoke, and doubt, she had delivered all 18 of them into relative safety. History holds many women like Mira, underestimated until crisis forced their strength into the open. From Nightingale's hospitals to unnamed nurses under fire, they were doubted yet saved lives through calm and resolve. In Alpha Base's tunnels, Mira proved the same truth. Underestimated doesn't mean unprepared, and the one least expected can become the one no one can live without. Through fire, through smoke, through collapsing walls and choking air, Lieutenant Mira Callen led 18 wounded men to safety. She didn't do it with weapons or rank. She did it with clarity, determination, and courage. And in doing so, she reminded the world of something it too easily forgets. Heroes don't always come from the front lines. They often come from the shadows, carrying others through the fire. The maintenance bunker was barely quiet when the new threat came. At first it was faint, the low rumble of vehicles overhead, the metallic clatter of boots against steel. Then came the voices, foreign, sharp, echoing down the tunnel. Mira Callen froze where she stood, hands still red with bandages. The enemy had arrived. Private Williams, guarding the entrance with a rifle he could barely hold, whispered, "They've found us." His words sent a chill through the wounded men who lay against the walls. Some tried to lift their weapons, but most were too weak even to sit up. The door to the bunker burst open with the force of a battering ram. 3 enemy soldiers stormed inside, rifles raised, eyes scanning the dim space. Mira instinctively stepped forward, positioning herself between the invaders and her wounded men. Her uniform was torn, her face streaked with soot, but her posture was defiant. One of the soldiers barked in broken English, "American doctor?" Mira straightened her shoulders. "Lieutenant Mira Callen, United States Army Medical Corps. These are my patients." The soldier exchanged glances with his comrades before lowering his rifle slightly. "You come with us. Our men need treatment, now." A murmur swept the bunker. Sergeant Torres hissed, "Ma'am, don't go. They'll use you and kill the rest of us." Mira looked at him, then at the 18 wounded who depended on her. Her heart pounded with the weight of an impossible choice. Every medic learns the same principle. Under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel are protected and expected to treat the wounded of all sides without discrimination. To save life is the duty, regardless of uniform. Yet here, theory met brutal reality. If she obeyed, she would be helping the very men who had turned Alpha Base into ruins, who had killed her comrades only hours earlier. Her loyalty screamed to refuse. But if she resisted, the enemy would not hesitate to force her, or worse, punish the helpless soldiers behind her. The lead soldier raised his rifle toward one of the stretcher cases. His meaning was clear: comply or watch them die. Mira's jaw tightened. "I'll go, but I need 5 minutes to stabilize my most critical patients first." The soldier frowned but nodded. She moved quickly, whispering instructions to Torres as she worked. "Keep them alive. No matter what happens to me, don't let them give up. Rescue will come." Then she handed over her remaining supplies, adjusted an IV for a man drifting toward unconsciousness, and finally stood tall. "I'm ready." Escorted through the charred ruins of Alpha Base, Mira saw the devastation in full for the first time. The barracks were ash, vehicles burned out skeletons. Enemy soldiers moved among the wreckage with brutal efficiency, establishing their own command post in the half-standing shell of the old operations building. They led her inside, where wounded enemy fighters lay on the floor. Some groaned in pain, others clutched shattered limbs. A young soldier, barely older than 19, whimpered as blood seeped through a crude bandage on his chest. Mira's training took over once more. Her hands did not ask what side a patient belonged to. They asked only, "What must I do to keep him alive?" She set broken bones, stopped bleeding, administered morphine where she could. Her captors watched carefully, but none interfered. To them, she was now a tool, an American medic pressed into their service. Yet inside, Mira carried the unbearable weight of dual loyalties. Each stitch she sewed for the enemy was a moment stolen from her own men waiting in the bunker. Each life she preserved here meant another hour her soldiers suffered without her care. What Mira faced that night wasn't only physical exhaustion, it was the battlefield of conscience. The war inside her was fiercer than the bombs outside. On one hand, she was a soldier, bound by loyalty to her comrades and her country. On the other, she was a medic, sworn to save lives regardless of uniform or flag. To violate the Geneva Convention was to betray the very principle that gave medical officers protection in war. Yet to honor it meant healing those who had just slaughtered her friends. This is the hidden torment of medics. They do not only bleed on the battlefield, they carry the moral scars of every decision. Soldiers with rifles live with the weight of who they kill. Medics live with the weight of who they could not save, and sometimes who they had to save against their heart's will. History rarely records these stories. We remember battles won, but not the ethical wars fought in dark bunkers and makeshift hospitals. Medics fight fear and guilt as much as bullets. In past wars, many treated enemies alongside comrades and carried those choices as lasting scars. That night, Lieutenant Mira Callen joined them, both soldier and healer, torn yet unbroken. The enemy captured her body, but never her resolve. At dawn, as distant rotor blades announced the approach of Commander Briggs's rescue force, Mira stood in the enemy's makeshift infirmary, exhausted but unbroken. She had kept her captors wounded alive while silently praying her own men still clung to life in the bunker. Captured, coerced, and torn by ethics, she remained what she had always been, a medic who refused to surrender her humanity. And in that defiance, Lieutenant Mira Callen proved that not all battles are fought with weapons. Some are fought within the soul, and victory means simply refusing to break. The thrum of helicopter blades broke the dawn silence. For the first time in more than 20 hours, hope swept across Alpha Base. Commander Nathaniel Briggs had arrived with the rescue force, armored vehicles rolling through the shattered gates, infantry establishing a perimeter, medevac crews on standby. From the air, the compound looked like nothing more than ruins and ash. Yet buried within those ruins were 18 wounded soldiers, and the medic who had kept them alive. Inside the enemy command post, Lieutenant Mira Callen straightened at the sound. She was still surrounded by hostile guards, still forced to treat enemy wounded. But she knew that sound meant her men had a chance. Private Chen's desperate radio call had not been in vain. Moments later, an enemy officer, the same Major Petro who had claimed her as a medical asset, stepped forward with a cold smile. "Your commander has arrived. Now we negotiate." The radios crackled. Briggs's voice was steady, authoritative. "This is Commander Nathaniel Briggs of the United States Navy. We know you're holding American wounded. We're here to evacuate them. Do not harm them." Major Petro's reply came sharp and mocking. "We have 19 Americans, including your medic. They are alive for now. You will withdraw your forces, and in return, we will consider their release." Mira stood in the corner, listening, every nerve on edge. Around her lay enemy casualties she had been treating for hours. Her hands were numb with exhaustion, but her mind remained fixed on the bunker across the compound. 18 soldiers, her soldiers, were waiting, their lives draining away with every minute of delay. She clenched her jaw. Infection had already set in for Sergeant Martinez's chest wound. Williams's fever was rising. Chen had drifted into unconsciousness again. Time was killing them as surely as bullets would. The standoff stretched into hours. Neither side wanted to escalate, but neither trusted the other. Negotiators passed demands back and forth. Safe passage for the wounded in exchange for enemy prisoners, medical supplies for guarantees of restraint. Every delay felt like a dagger to Mira's chest. While the officers argued, she worked. Even as a captive, she could not stop. She tore bandages into strips, improvised splints from broken wood, whispered encouragement to the men fading before her eyes. She had promised them she would come back, and promises in war are heavier than steel. At one point, she turned to the enemy officer and spoke with quiet fire. "If you stall much longer, they will die, and then you'll have nothing to bargain with. Let me go to them." Petro considered her words, then sneered. "Soon, not yet." Mira returned to her work, but inside her chest, anger and helplessness burned hotter than the fire still smoldering above ground. Outside, Briggs weighed his options. A direct assault would risk the hostages. Waiting meant more Americans dying underground. His men pressed him for action, but he held his line, voice even. "Not until we have a deal. We didn't come here for a massacre. We came for our people." He knew what few could understand. Rescue isn't just about pulling survivors out. It's about ensuring there's something left to rescue. Mira Callen had done the impossible already, keeping 18 soldiers alive for nearly a day under bombardment. Now it was Briggs's responsibility to bring them home without sacrificing them in the process. Hours dragged on before an agreement was finally reached. A prisoner exchange, wounded for wounded, medics for medics. Mira was returned to the bunker, racing down the tunnels with what little strength she had left. When she burst into the chamber, the sight nearly broke her. Martinez gasping, Williams delirious, Chen barely breathing. She didn't pause to rest. She dropped to her knees and resumed work as if she had never left. Tourniquets were tightened, antibiotics injected, wounds reopened and drained. Every action was a race against time. The evacuation helicopters were waiting, but Mira refused to move a man until he was stable enough to survive the flight. When at last the stretchers were loaded into the medevacs, Commander Briggs stood back and watched in silence. Every soldier was alive, barely but alive. Yet survival carried its own weight. Briggs saw it in Mira's eyes, the haunted look of someone who had borne decisions no one should carry. He saw it in the blank stares of the wounded, men who would live but never be free from the memory of that night. Survival has its cost. War doesn't end when the shooting stops. It lingers in nightmares of explosions and screams. For medics like Mira, the burden is doubled. Their own scars and the faces they fought to keep alive. History will say 18 soldiers were saved at Alpha Base. It won't mention the silence in the helicopter, Mira's trembling hands, or Briggs questioning his choices. Survival is victory, yes, but it is also a weight, sometimes heavier than the battle itself. When the final helicopter lifted away from Alpha Base, dawn revealed a landscape of ash and ruin. The barracks were gone, the command tower reduced to rubble, and yet, against all logic, every one of the 18 wounded soldiers had survived. They lay strapped to stretchers inside the medevac, IV bags swaying, breathing shallow but steady. Commander Nathaniel Briggs, standing in the debris, exhaled in disbelief. He had arrived expecting to find a morgue. Instead, he was leaving with a miracle. And at the center of it all was Lieutenant Mira Callen. News of her actions spread quickly through military channels. The official after-action report repeated words like impossible, extraordinary, unprecedented. Briggs himself wrote, Lieutenant Callen carried the weight of command in conditions where no command remained. Her decisions preserved an entire unit. Weeks later, Mira was called to a ceremony. The uniform was clean this time, her posture crisp. A general pinned the silver star on her chest and she was promoted to captain. The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. To those watching, it was a moment of triumph. Yet when she was asked to speak, Mira kept her words simple. I only did my job. My duty is to keep my patients alive. She accepted recognition not as proof of heroism, but as confirmation that the wounded she saved were still breathing. For her, that was the only reward that mattered. Mira's humility points us to a deeper truth. Wars are often remembered for noise. The thunder of artillery, the orders of generals, the victories carved into maps. But battles are often decided by those who work quietly in the shadows. The medics who patch arteries in the dark. The logisticians who keep supplies moving through chaos. The radio operators who ensure voices carry when the lines are cut. They do not get monuments. They rarely headline history books. Yet without them, even the bravest warriors fall. Mira Callen was one of these quiet professionals. She never fired a rifle that night. She never stormed a position. And yet she carried 18 men across the thin line between death and life. That is not less heroic. It is in many ways more. But recognition cannot erase the unseen weight. Mira carried the scars of triage, the memory of choosing who was treated first, who had to wait, and the fear that one wrong decision could mean a friend's death. Soldiers often live with the memory of those they killed. Medics live with the memory of those they could not save. That burden rarely makes it into the record. History will say Alpha Base produced 18 survivors. It will not mention the silence in the helicopter, the haunted looks, or Mira's trembling hands after hours of stitching wounds in darkness. Survival was victory, yes, but it was also weight. Lieutenant Mira Callen will forever be remembered as the medic who saved 18 lives at Alpha Base. But her legacy is larger than a medal or a promotion. It is the reminder that the strongest heroes are often the quietest, the ones who do their duty in silence, never asking to be called heroes, but forever changing the lives around them. As we close this story, I want you to think about something bigger than Alpha Base. Mira Callen's courage isn't just a tale of war. It's a lesson for life today. In America, many of us have seen it in quieter forms. The grandmother who holds a family together after loss, the neighbor who shows up when disaster strikes, the nurse who works through the night shift so strangers can see the morning. These are our medics, though they may never wear a uniform. The truth is, real strength often hides in silence. It doesn't always come from those with the loudest voices or the highest ranks. It comes from the people who refuse to let others fall, even when no one is watching. That's something worth remembering in our homes, our communities, and our nation. But I'd like to hear from you. Who are the medics in your own life? Who carried you through when everything seemed to fall apart? Share your stories in the comments. I promise, someone else might need to hear them. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need a reminder of quiet courage. Thank you for spending this time with me today. And remember, sometimes the strongest heroes are the ones who never call themselves heroes.